that constant desire to disappear all day, to simply vanish from the weight of existence, from the endless parade of obligations and expectations that seem to drain the very essence from your being. Perhaps this isn't the pathology that modern psychology would have you believe. Perhaps this overwhelming urge to retreat, to become invisible, to slip away from the theater of everyday life is actually your soul crying out for something so profound, so essential, that your entire being is willing to risk everything just to touch it for a moment. You feel it, don't you? That deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep can cure. That bone-deep weariness that comes not from doing too much, but from being asked to be someone you're not, day after day after day. It's as if you're wearing a costume that's several sizes too small, and every breath, every movement, every forced smile is a reminder that you're suffocating in a life that was never meant to be yours. This isn't the familiar tiredness that comes from physical exertion or even mental strain. This is something far more existential, a fatigue that penetrates the very core of your being and whispers that you're living a lie so convincing that even you have begun to believe it. When you wake up each morning and feel that immediate heaviness, that sense of dread at having to put on the performance once again, your soul is trying to tell you something that your rational mind isn't ready to hear, that the life you're living is fundamentally incompatible with the consciousness you truly are. The desire to disappear isn't escapism, it's your deepest intelligence recognizing that you've become trapped in a version of yourself that was designed by others, for others, and has nothing to do with the wild, mysterious, infinitely creative being that you actually are. Modern society has become extraordinarily sophisticated at creating the illusion that this exhaustion is normal, that this constant low-level depression is simply the price of being a responsible adult. We're told that the solution is better time management, more self-care, perhaps some meditation or exercise, anything except the one thing your soul is actually asking for: permission to completely dissolve the false identity you've been carrying and discover what emerges from that sacred emptiness. The culture offers you 1,000 ways to manage your symptoms but actively discourages you from examining the fundamental cause, that you're trying to live as someone you're not, in a world that profits from your disconnection from your authentic nature. When you observe this phenomenon closely, this persistent longing for disappearance, you begin to recognize it as a form of spiritual hunger, a sacred restlessness that emerges when the soul recognizes that it's been living in exile from its own truth. Like a plant that turns toward the light even in the darkest room, your consciousness is constantly seeking alignment with something greater, something more authentic, something that resonates with the frequency of who you truly are beneath all the layers of conditioning and compromise. The desire to disappear isn't a desire for non-existence. It's a desire for the death of everything that isn't genuinely you, everything that has been imposed upon you by a world that profits from your conformity and suffers from your authenticity. But here's where the mystery deepens. This longing for disappearance often becomes most intense precisely when your life appears most successful by conventional standards. You may have achieved the career, the relationship, the lifestyle that everyone around you envies, and yet you find yourself feeling more hollow, more disconnected, more desperate to escape than ever before. This isn't ingratitude or self-sabotage. This is your soul's wisdom recognizing that external success built on internal betrayal is actually a form of spiritual suicide. The more you succeed at being someone you're not, the more urgently your authentic self calls for liberation, even if that liberation looks like disappearing from everything you've worked so hard to create. Think of the caterpillar in its final days before transformation. It doesn't simply decide one morning to become a butterfly. Instead, it experiences what scientists call imaginal discs, these mysterious clusters of cells that hold the blueprint for wings, for flight, for a completely different way of being. But before these can activate, before the miracle of metamorphosis can occur, the caterpillar must enter a phase of dissolution so complete that if you were to open the chrysalis during this time, you would find not a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, but what appears to be primordial soup, the complete breakdown of one form of life to make space for another. This is what your soul is calling for when it whispers its desperate desire to disappear. Not the end of you, but the end of the false you, the constructed you, the you that was designed to fit into systems that were never designed to honor your true nature. The caterpillar doesn't understand what's happening to it during this dissolution. It has no concept of wings or flight. All it knows is that its familiar form is dissolving into chaos, and if it could speak, it might describe this experience as a desire to disappear, to escape the unbearable process of disintegration. But what the caterpillar doesn't know is that its imaginal discs, the blueprint for its future self, can only activate when the old structure completely lets go. The butterfly isn't an improved version of the caterpillar. It's an entirely different being that emerges from the willing dissolution of what came before. The modern world, in its magnificent complexity and terrifying superficiality, has created countless ways to avoid this sacred dissolution. We have entertainment that numbs, substances that distract, relationships that enable us to remain unconscious, careers that keep us too busy to hear the deeper calling. But perhaps most insidiously, we have created a culture of perpetual self-improvement that allows us to feel like we're growing while actually preventing any real transformation from taking place. We optimize our productivity, upgrade our habits, accumulate spiritual practices like trophies, all while carefully avoiding the one thing that authentic growth actually requires: the complete willingness to let go of who we think we are. This resistance to dissolution is understandable. The ego, that constructed sense of self that you've spent decades building and defending, correctly recognizes that your desire to disappear is actually a desire for its death, and so it offers you 1,000 compromises: better self-care, more mindfulness, perhaps a vacation or a change of scenery, anything that might satisfy your restlessness without actually threatening the fundamental structure of your false identity. But your soul, in its infinite wisdom and relentless persistence, continues to send you the signal: disappear from this false life, retreat into the wilderness of your own being, allow the constructed self to die so that something authentic can be born. The tragedy is that most people spend their entire lives negotiating with this call, trying to find ways to honor their spiritual hunger without actually undergoing the transformation their soul is demanding. They become spiritual consumers, collecting teachers and techniques and insights, hoping that the right combination of external practices will somehow satisfy the internal longing for authenticity. But the soul's call to disappear cannot be appeased by addition. It can only be honored by subtraction, by the systematic removal of everything that isn't true, everything that was acquired rather than remembered, everything that serves the image rather than the essence. This isn't depression speaking. This is the voice of your deepest intelligence recognizing that the life you're living is too small for the consciousness you house. Depression is what happens when you resist this call, when you try to force yourself to be content with a life that fundamentally contradicts your nature. The desire to disappear is actually the antidote to depression. It's your psyche's attempt to guide you toward the death that leads to rebirth rather than the slow suicide of pretending to be someone you're not. The invitation to disappear becomes most urgent when you've spent years, perhaps decades, performing a version of yourself that earns approval but costs you your vitality. You've learned to speak the language of productivity, to measure your worth by your output, to sacrifice your presence for your performance. And somewhere deep within, a part of you that remembers a different way of being begins to revolt. It doesn't revolt with anger, though anger may be present. It revolts with exhaustion, with a bone-deep weariness that says, I cannot continue to pretend that this artificial life is satisfying the hunger of my soul. I want to pause for a moment and ask you directly, when did you first notice that desire to simply vanish from your everyday life? That moment when you realized that the thought of disappearing, of stepping completely out of all your roles and responsibilities, brought more relief than anxiety? When the fantasy of becoming invisible, of slipping away from everyone's expectations and demands, felt like the first breath of fresh air you'd had in months, or maybe years? I know this longing can feel frightening, especially when you've been taught to interpret it as a sign of weakness or mental illness. You look around at others who seem perfectly content with their structured lives, their predictable routines, their willingness to trade freedom for security, and you wonder if there's something fundamentally wrong with you for craving something so different. And the most challenging part isn't the longing itself, but the isolation that comes with carrying a desire that few around you seem to understand or share. I want you to know that your soul's calling to disappear is not a pathology to be fixed, but a sacred communication to be honored. That your deep need for retreat, for stepping out of the conventional flow of existence, is actually your consciousness recognizing its own expansion beyond the containers that once held it. And that's why I'd like to invite you to share a fragment of your experience in the comments below. You can simply copy this phrase and complete it. The moment I most wanted to disappear was when, by doing this, you not only acknowledge the validity of your own spiritual hunger, but you also offer permission to someone else who might be watching this feeling like they're alone in their desire for a completely different way of being. Your comment might be the lifeline someone needs to recognize that their longing for disappearance isn't a sign of failure, but a sign of their soul's readiness for transformation. This invisible community of souls who feel too large for their current lives, scattered throughout the world, finds strength every time we acknowledge the truth of our experience. Like seeds that recognize each other's presence in the soil, we create the conditions for mutual sprouting when we stop hiding our readiness to grow beyond our current form. Now, Let's explore what happens when you stop interpreting your desire to disappear as a problem and start recognizing it as the first movement toward the most authentic life you've ever imagined. The paradox of disappearing is that the more completely you allow yourself to vanish from the false life, the more vibrantly you appear in your authentic one. This isn't about running away from responsibility or abandoning those who depend on you. This is about recognizing that your highest responsibility is to live from the truth of who you are, and that sometimes this requires a period of withdrawal, a time of conscious invisibility, where you can reconnect with the essence that has been buried under years of playing roles that never quite fit. In indigenous cultures, this period of disappearing was not only understood but actively supported. Vision quests, wilderness fasts, periods of solitude where the individual would leave the tribe temporarily to seek their true name, their authentic purpose, their place in the larger web of existence. These weren't seen as escapes from reality, but as journeys into a deeper reality, a dimension of being where the soul could remember itself without the constant interference of social expectations and external demands. Your contemporary desire to disappear carries the same essential impulse, the need to step outside the consensus reality long enough to remember who you were before the world told you who you should be. This disappearing doesn't require you to leave your geographical location or abandon your relationships, though sometimes it might. More often it requires you to disappear from the internal story you've been telling yourself about what you owe others, what you should be doing with your time, what constitutes a successful or meaningful life according to standards you never consciously chose. The fear that arises around this desire to vanish often stems from a misunderstanding of what disappearing actually means. We've been conditioned to believe that visibility equals value, that constant availability equals love, that perpetual productivity equals purpose. But your soul knows something that your conditioned mind has forgotten, that the most profound transformations occur in the darkness, in the quiet spaces between words, in the fertile void that exists when you stop trying to be anything at all and simply allow yourself to discover what emerges from that spaciousness. When you honor your need to disappear, even in small ways, you begin to notice that what you thought was depression or avoidance was actually your consciousness trying to protect something precious within you. It was trying to preserve a spark of authenticity that could only survive by withdrawing from environments that consistently demanded you to be less than you are. Your soul's wisdom knew that continued exposure to situations that required you to diminish yourself would eventually extinguish the very fire that makes life worth living. There's a particular quality to this protective withdrawal that distinguishes it from ordinary avoidance or escapism. When you're running away from something, you feel agitated, anxious, desperate to get away. But when you're honoring your soul's call to disappear, there's often a deep sense of relief, a feeling of coming home to yourself, even in the midst of uncertainty about what comes next. This is because your consciousness recognizes that you're finally moving in alignment with your deepest nature, rather than against it. The loneliness that accompanies this desire to vanish is perhaps its most challenging aspect, and yet it's also one of its most sacred dimensions. You find yourself surrounded by people who seem perfectly content with lives that feel suffocating to you, and you begin to wonder if your need for something more spacious, more authentic, more aligned with your inner truth is actually a form of selfishness or spiritual grandiosity. But this loneliness is not evidence of your disconnection from others. It's evidence of your connection to something larger than the small circles of conventional existence that most people accept as the full range of human possibility. This spiritual loneliness is actually a kind of homesickness, a longing for a quality of being that you remember but can't quite locate in your current circumstances. It's the soul's way of telling you that you've outgrown your current context, that you're ready for a larger conversation about what it means to be human. And while this can feel isolating, it's also the beginning of your initiation into a deeper community, a tribe of consciousness that exists beyond geographical boundaries and social conventions. Your longing to disappear is actually a longing to appear as who you truly are, which requires the temporary dissolution of who you've been pretending to be. This is the sacred work of conscious dying while living, allowing the false self to compost, so that the authentic self can take root in the rich soil of your awakened presence. It's not about becoming invisible to the world, it's about becoming transparent to yourself, so clear in your own being that you can no longer tolerate the opacity of living in ways that contradict your deepest knowing. The practical wisdom that emerges from honoring this call to disappear begins with small acts of conscious withdrawal, but it quickly evolves into a completely different way of being in the world. Perhaps it starts with taking 15 minutes each morning to sit in silence before the day demands that you become functional. Perhaps it's saying no to social obligations that drain your energy without feeding your soul. Perhaps it's creating physical spaces in your home where you can retreat from the role of being useful to others and simply practice being present to yourself. But as you begin to trust this process, you may find that your relationship to everything changes. Work stops being something you do to prove your worth and becomes an expression of your creativity. Relationships stop being arenas for performing love and become opportunities for genuine intimacy. Even mundane activities like eating, walking, or doing household tasks can become sacred when you're no longer approaching them from the exhausted place of trying to be someone you're not. The key insight is that disappearing from the false self doesn't require dramatic external changes. It requires a shift in the quality of your presence, a willingness to inhabit your life from the inside out rather than from the outside in. This means paying attention to what genuinely nourishes you versus what you think should nourish you. It means honoring your energy as sacred rather than treating it as an unlimited resource that others can consume without consequence. This process requires tremendous discernment because the false self is extraordinarily cunning. It will try to co-opt even your desire for authenticity, turning it into another performance, another way to be special or spiritual or evolved. The soul's call to disappear cannot be satisfied by adopting the identity of someone who is spiritual. It can only be honored by the ongoing practice of letting go of all identities, all roles, all the stories you tell yourself about who you are or who you should be. As you begin to honor these smaller disappearances, you may notice that your capacity for authentic presence with others actually increases. This is the beautiful paradox. The more you allow yourself to withdraw from false connection, the more available you become for genuine intimacy. The more you step back from performing productivity, the more creative and inspired your actual work becomes. The more you disappear from the exhausting theater of trying to be what others expect, the more magnetic you become to those who recognize and appreciate your authentic self. The ultimate realization that emerges from this journey of conscious disappearing is that you were never meant to fit into the boxes that society creates for human potential. Your desire to vanish is your soul's intelligence recognizing that you are far too vast, too complex, too mysterious to be contained by any single role, relationship, or set of expectations. You are not meant to be a consistent character in someone else's story. You are meant to be the ever-changing, ever-expanding protagonist of your own unique exploration of what it means to be conscious in this strange and wonderful universe. When you finally allow yourself to disappear from everything that isn't authentically you, what emerges is not the absence of yourself, but the presence of your true self, perhaps for the first time in your adult life. This presence is simultaneously more gentle and more powerful than anything you experienced while trying to be someone else. It's a presence that doesn't need to prove itself, defend itself, or explain itself to anyone, because it knows that its value comes not from what it does, but from what it is, a unique expression of consciousness, exploring itself through the adventure of your particular human experience. The world needs you to honor this call to disappear, because the world needs what wants to emerge from your authentic being. Every time you choose to honor your soul's wisdom over society's expectations, you create a ripple in the field of collective consciousness that gives others permission to do the same. Your courage to disappear from a false life becomes an invitation for others to question their own willingness to live smaller than their souls are asking them to live. Trust the process. Trust the wisdom of your desire to vanish from everything that diminishes you, and trust that what wants to emerge from this conscious disappearing is more beautiful, more free, more alive than anything you could have imagined, while you were still trying to fit into containers that were never designed to hold the fullness of who you are. Your soul is not calling you to disappear because something is wrong with you. It's calling you to disappear because something is ready to be born through you, and birth always requires a period of retreat from the ordinary world into the sacred darkness where all authentic transformation begins. If these reflections on the soul's call to disappear touched something deep within your being, know that you are not alone in feeling too large for the life you've been living. This path of conscious withdrawal from false existence can seem frightening when those around you don't understand why someone would voluntarily step away from what appears to be a perfectly acceptable life. It's precisely for this reason that we've created this sanctuary, this refuge for souls who recognize that their deepest longing is not for more of what the world offers, but for the space to discover what emerges when you stop trying to be anything other than what you authentically are. By subscribing to this channel, you become part of an invisible community of beings who, like you, are learning to trust the wisdom of their own disappearing. Each new exploration we share is like a whisper in the darkness, reminding you that your desire to step away from conventional existence isn't a sign of weakness or failure, but a sign of your consciousness preparing for its next expansion. We're not here to offer quick fixes or easy answers to the complex art of authentic living. We're here to walk together through the sacred territory of conscious transformation, to validate your experience when the world around you cannot understand why someone would choose depth over security, authenticity over approval, truth over comfort. If you feel your soul calling you to disappear from everything that isn't genuinely you, if you recognize the exhaustion that comes from living in ways that contradict your deepest nature, this channel is your reminder that such callings are not problems to be solved, but invitations to be honored. Subscribe and allow yourself to be nourished by reflections that recognize both the challenge and the profound beauty of living from the truth of who you are. Together we form a constellation of disappearing souls, each becoming invisible to the false world so that we can become visible to the true one. A simple click on the subscription button is a quiet declaration that says, I too am ready to honor my soul's call to disappear from everything that isn't authentic, so that something real can finally emerge. And that, in a culture that profits from keeping us visible in all the wrong ways, is perhaps the most radical and necessary form of spiritual activism available to us.